Bible is full of stories that we all know and love. But how well do we know them? The answer might surprise you. The Bible you thought you knew is going to dive deep into the exquisite details of the biblical stories that make them fascinating and transforming. In this week's podcast, we are going to deal with the story of Ehud that is narrated in the book of Judges, chapter 3. Judges is not a well-known book, even though it features people like Deborah, Gideon, and Samson. Among these fairly well-known characters is an obscure character, Ehud. Many of the stories in this book are strange, to say the least. Among the strangest is the account that features Ehud. Keep in mind that the stories narrated for most of the book of Judges follow a set pattern. That pattern consists of 6 elements. 1. Israel commits some sort of evil. 2. In response, the Israelite God punishes Israel by allowing them to be oppressed by a foreign power. 3. After a period of oppression, the Israelites cry out in misery. 4. When the Israelite God hears this cry, the deity raises up a person to rescue the people. This Savior is called a judge. 5. The judge delivers the people from their oppressor. And 6. Israel enjoys a period when they are no longer oppressed. After each story, the pattern is repeated. The Ehud story appears early on in the book of Judges. The story begins, as noted, when Israel does something wrong. In this case, no specific sin is mentioned. That's in verse 12 of chapter 3. Because of Israel's misdeeds, the Lord strengthened Eglon, the king of Moab, to deliver punishment to Israel. Eglon made use of Ammonites and Amalekites to make Israel's life miserable. This coalition not only defeated Israel militarily, but managed to take possession of one of Israel's cities. That's in verse 13 of chapter 3. For 18 long years, Israel suffered under this oppression. That's in verse 14. Because of the oppression, of course, Israel eventually cried out to God, at which point the deity responded by raising up a deliverer, Ehud ben Gera, a Benjaminite. Curiously, when Ehud is introduced, we are informed that he happened to be left-handed. Divulging such an odd detail is hardly accidental. Almost surely this will play a role in the developing narrative. That's in verse 15. One other detail that we need to keep in mind is that Israel sent tribute to Eglon, the Moabite king, by having Ehud deliver it. Tribute in this instance is a fancy word for an extortion fee. How or why Ehud was selected for this duty is left unsaid. However, when Ehud prepares to see to it that Eglon receives the tribute, we learn that he had previously armed himself with a 2-edged sword, about a cubit in length. Under what circumstance would a Moabite king allow an Israelite in his presence armed with a sword or a dagger? The answer is obvious. Under no circumstance would this ever be allowed. But when we are told that Ehud tucked the sword under his clothes on his right side, we realize why we were informed that he was left-handed. A potential assassin would surely be right-handed, meaning that his weapon would likely to be on his left side. Apparently, the possibility of a left-handed assassin never occurred to anyone around Eglon. One other detail is important as this scene unfolds. Eglon was a very fat man. That's in verse 17 of chapter 3. So, in our imagination, we watched Ehud carrying a concealed weapon on his right side, approaching Eglon, the portly Moabite king, to present the fee that Israel was obligated to supply. After Ehud delivered the tribute, he dismissed the people who had helped him carry it. That's in verse 18. But Ehud himself turned back to present himself once again to Eglon. The biblical text notes that Ehud turned back when he was adjacent to the Pusalim, often translated as sculptured stones. In truth, these Pusalim suggested idolatrous symbols. In other words, Ehud is symbolizing Israel's turning away from idolatrous worship, of which they were so often guilty in the book of Judges. In any case, in no time at all, Ehud is once again in the presence of Eglon. This time, however, Ehud tells the king that he has a secret message for him. Here is where the elasticity of Hebrew is so delicious. A secret message or a secret word also means a sacred thing as well. We who are reading the story already have a good idea that the secret thing is neither a message or a word, but a thing, namely a two-edged sword that Ehud is concealing on his person. If we conclude that those protecting the Moabite king lacked any imagination at all, or were simply the epitome of incompetence, our presumptions will soon be confirmed. When Eglon heard that Ehud had a secret message, he could not wait to hear it. For reasons that pass understanding, the king immediately orders all those around him to leave the room. Evidently, he figured that the secret message would be something worthwhile, and he did not want any of his attendants to know what it might be. All of a sudden, the Moabite king is left alone with a left-handed Israelite who was sporting a sword. Then Ehud ups the ante. Once the two men are alone, Ehud lets the king know that the message is from God. Obviously intrigued, Eglon stood. That's in verse 20. At that point, the fact that Ehud was left-handed comes into play. With his left hand, he reaches to the concealed sword on his right side and thrusts the weapon into the king's ample belly. That's in verse 21. The narrative does not spare us the gory details, for Ehud pushed the sword up to its hilt and effectively eviscerated his victim. Nasty stuff spilled out of the king's gut. That's in verse 22. Ehud quickly escaped, apparently into a side room, as he locked the door of the king's chamber behind him and fled. That's in verse 23. As Ehud was escaping, Eglon's servants were outside the king's chamber. They realized that the doors were locked. However, no one wanted to disturb the king since they thought he was relieving himself. Why they concluded that explains why Ehud had stabbed the king so violently. When a person is eviscerated, bowel odors emanate. That is exactly why the king's servants figured he was going to the bathroom. Though the story is indelicate, Ehud's move brilliantly allowed him more time to escape. At last, the attendants thought that they could no longer wait. Surely something was wrong. They fetched a key, opened the door, and found the monarch lying dead on the floor. That's in verse 25. The narrative then goes back to Ehud's escape. Just as he had previously passed the Pusalim, the sculptured stones, on the way to present the tribute to Eglon, Ehud now passed them again during his escape. That's in verse 26. Again, the symbolism is hardly subtle. These stones represent the idols that had tempted Israel. When Ehud passed by them twice, that indicated a change of attitude and a change of heart relative to these idols. At least for a while, Israel would worship exclusively the Israelite deity. When Ehud got back to Israelite territory, the hill country of Ephraim to be exact, he summoned troops. Ehud's assassination of the Moabite king was not the only thing he would accomplish in Israel's behalf. He had every intention of leading an army against Moab. That's in verse 28. Ehud led his quickly mustered troops to the fords of the Jordan River, which the Moabite troops would need to cross to challenge Israel. The blockade was a successful strategy. Israel prevented the Moabite troops from entering Israelite territory. In the end, the Israelite army routed the Moabite army. The years of Moabite oppression had come to an end. After enduring 18 years of oppression at Moabite hands, Israel now enjoyed 80 years of freedom. Ehud had been able to free Israel. Of course, initially the Lord, the Israelite deity, had made sure that Israel had a deliverer in the person of Ehud, the left-handed judge. In conclusion, I want to emphasize a couple of points. One has to do with the nomenclature of this book. Why are judges called judges? Typically, a judge is someone who hears cases, pronounces verdicts, engages in jurisprudence, and the like. The judges in this book do not operate in that courtly realm. The only judge who comes close to that is Deborah. All the others are military figures. In this book, a judge is someone who executes the will of a sovereign. In this case, not a state, but a deity. Even though the Israelite God had consigned Israel to foreign oppression, this same God ended the punishment by raising up someone who would reverse the situation. Ehud, in this instance, was that person. Thus, he judged Israel by executing justice in God's behalf for the sake of Israel. A second point has to do with the combination of the divine will and human ingenuity. Even though God raised up a judge to deal with something, God left the strategy up to the people who were responsible. Apparently, Ehud came up with a strategy on his own. Somehow he believed that his being left-handed would put him in a position to carry out this bold move. It was extremely dangerous. He had to risk being searched, had to figure out how to get himself alone with the king, had to have a plan that would make the king's aides wait outside his private chamber long enough, and had to have an exit route plan. Ehud did all that on his own. That was the pattern throughout this book. God raised up the judge, and then God allowed the judge to do whatever he or she thought was necessary. One final point is that each of the judges gets successively worse than his or her predecessor, morally speaking. Because Ehud was among the earliest judges, he seems to have done nothing particularly wrong. Deborah, also, who was a judge after Shamgar, who just immediately followed Ehud, that's in verse 31 of chapter 3, seems to have been pretty good, though her military officer left much to be desired. Still, as the narrative develops, each judge gets progressively worse. The last one, Samson, breaks all records for his own foibles. But in this early part of the book of Judges, the people who were elevated to that position did only what they needed to do. Left-handed Ehud was such a judge. Please go to my website, faspina.com. Let me know what your email is so I can contact you later. Also, if you have a question you'd like me to address in a subsequent Q&A session, email me at fspina106@gmail.com. I want to thank you so very much for listening to The Bible You Thought You Knew. I have a question for you. Do you have a question or topic that you'd like me to cover on the podcast? If so, all you need to do is head over to Apple Podcasts and do two simple things. One, leave a rating and review telling me what you think of the podcast. Two, in that review, ask anything you want related to the Bible. That's all you have to do. Then, listen in to hear your question answered on a future episode. Join us next time on The Bible You Thought You Knew when we discuss Jesus' personal Bible. God bless.